just before the car rolled to a stop beneath the old trees at the Fairmont Crest gates. Everything had already begun in a moment that looked deceptively calm, with Hayley sitting beside Caroline in a sunlit kitchen, the phone between them and 2 cups of cooling coffee, scraps of paper scattered like the remnants of an ordinary day. Bill's voice had cut through that quiet with the clean edge of emergency, carrying news of Chelsea's disappearance and laying down a boundary in the same breath, an unambiguous instruction not to come because the chaos was too delicate to absorb another moving part. When the call ended, a charged stillness lingered, and the space between what was asked and what felt necessary widened inside Hayley with every breath. On one side of that widening space stood instinct, the fierce pull to be near the center of the storm and refuse the comfortable safety of distance when a child was missing. On the other side stood a subtler but equally potent need to plant herself in the circle that defined Bill's world, to prove by proximity that she belonged not on the edges but at the core of his life when everything was breaking. Caroline watched, measured, careful, her comments stitched with concern yet pricked by doubt, reminding Hayley that crises reorder rooms and redraw maps, that silence can be mistaken for surrender, that those who stand too far away lose the right to shape the story later. Perhaps Caroline meant only to protect her friend from becoming invisible, or perhaps she pressed a little too knowingly on the tender place where Hayley's confidence ran thin. Either way, the effect was the same. The words landed like seeds in soil softened by worry. On the dimmed phone screen, the image that had been passing from hand to hand all afternoon. Bill and Dani, side by side in a simple appeal to the community, glowed for an instant in Hayley's memory and then pulsed like a bruise. It was not the content that stung but the symmetry, 2 parents moving in rhythm under a single purpose, a shape the public would recognize and reward. With that picture echoing and Caroline's careful urgings circling back on themselves, Hayley rose, tucked the phone into her pocket, gathered useless notes out of habit, and stepped away from the kitchen's soft light, leaving behind a friend who might simply be earnest or might have learned too well how to steer another person's fear. The ambiguity did not need to be solved today. It had already done its work. By the time Hayley crossed the threshold of the Great Hall, the house had consolidated into the particular order that only extreme urgency can produce. Maps pinned to walls bore red rings around likely routes and dead ends. Laptops glowed with incoming reports from law enforcement and volunteers, their lists of license plates and timestamps multiplying in neat columns. Footsteps and low voices braided into a restrained rhythm, the rhythm of people who know that panic wastes time. Hayley's arrival fell into that rhythm like an offbeat. Naomi saw her first, the fixed strain in her face sharpened into impatience. Nicole followed, calm but uncompromising, marking the perimeter that protected the work at hand. No one denied the legitimacy of Hayley's fear, yet boundaries are not judgments. They are the architecture that keeps a fragile structure from collapsing. The message was not that she did not matter, but that the house could not afford new variables. Hayley offered to share an important update, but the force of her presence eclipsed the shape of her words, and the air thickened as though the walls themselves needed to hold firm. The disturbance rippled toward the far side of the hall and drew Bill out from the inner rooms, exhaustion written into the set of his shoulders, the residue of calls and disappointments coloring his expression. He guided Hayley toward a quieter corner, away from the maps and keyboards, and repeated the same necessity he had already spoken over the phone. The operation had to remain tidy, roles clearly divided, focus undivided, every person in the right lane. The logic was unassailable, and yet logic seldom heals a private bruise. Across the room, a monitor had paused on the frame of Bill and Dani addressing the community, and even without sound the image carried its own authority. Hayley knew the priority, finding Chelsea, deserved every ounce of attention, but the mind does not become mechanical because a crisis demands it. The stress cracked the seal around older insecurities, and something in her shifted. She reached for Bill with the reflex of someone who needs a handhold in heavy surf and, at the same time, with the not quite conscious impulse to mark territory in a room that seemed to default to the old symmetry. Whether the embrace was a flare from panic or a quiet signature written in the air did not matter as much as the fact that it happened where others could see it. Dani, passing with a stack of printed tips from a hotline, noticed and rerouted without comment, setting the papers on the central table before returning to the screens. In that simple geometry, a line became visible. Dani stayed welded to the task because the task was the point. Hayley's need to anchor herself collided with the requirement to make herself small. The house absorbed the moment without cracking, but the floor warmed a few degrees beneath every step. After that came the expansions that always follow a single gesture. Inside the coordination room, Vernon and Anita sorted an incoming flood into usable streams, separating credible patterns from noise and compiling a priority board that could be worked without duplication. Jacob and Kat overlaid the last known pings from a device that had gone dark near an old industrial zone with accelerating reports from residents along the riverfront, building a lattice of times and angles that might sustain an actual search. Andre paced the perimeter of groups, returning with the small updates that keep stamina intact, while Naomi and Nicole reinforced the buffer around the rooms that had to remain quiet if the work was going to hold. Within this machinery, Hayley's contribution had to be tested, not indulged. She carried a second-hand sighting, passed along through Caroline, of a vehicle lingering near the warehouses at dawn. It might have been a thread or it might have been a tangle. The team logged it, tagged it for verification, and set it in a queue behind leads already stitched to timestamps and images. That triage was not a dismissal, but in Hayley's ears it echoed as exclusion, and exclusion is the kind of echo that breeds reckless alternatives. The temptation took a new shape, remaining in the house not because the house needed her but because presence might be mistaken for belonging, leaning into meetings that were designed for a smaller circle, contesting the silence that comes when one is not at the center. It was not that she meant to disrupt anything. It was that belonging and usefulness had become entwined in her mind. In parallel, Dani's orbit stayed tight around the workflows that moved the search forward. She flagged turns of phrase that suggested scripts rather than spontaneous calls, sent batches to an audio specialist to compare patterns, synchronized camera malfunctions from 3 different corridors with handwritten logs provided by older neighbors along the waterfront. No one could say she felt nothing. She had folded the feeling and put it away in a drawer that would remain shut until it could be unlocked without consequence. 2 female trajectories slid beside one another, one anchored by tasks, one tugged by anxieties that refused to be reasoned with. They did not collide. They etched a hairline fracture where competing definitions of family brushed past each other in a hallway too narrow for both. As evening deepened, the clock's steady tick seemed to score the entire house. Fatigue softened postures and sharpened tempers. In the waiting area, relatives and friends settled in as if for an overnight watch, whispering prayers, writing names on sign-up sheets for dawn searches, sharing blankets and coffee and intermittent hope. There, with time now her fiercest adversary, Hayley scrolled through messages from Caroline. Some lines offered strength in the language of resolve, insisting that stepping forward was not arrogance but fidelity, that distance can ossify into absence if left unchallenged. Other lines hinted at the optics of that circulating video, how the world prefers a clean narrative with a familiar pair at the front, how credits and gratitude tend to gravitate toward the faces that speak to cameras. None of it was overtly cruel. All of it pressed on the same tender place. Hayley stood and sat and stood again, drifting toward the coordination room's door as though gravity fluctuated. Inside, Dani cross-referenced rough notes from calls with time codes from traffic cameras that blinked out for minutes at a time without maintenance logs, attaching the resulting grid to a working hypothesis for the morning. Bill moved between rooms, a short call to a team at the water's edge, a short email to a relief organization for additional volunteers, a shorter pause at the threshold to ensure the hall did not devolve into noise. He knew Hayley's embrace could have been the life preserver a drowning person grabs, but he also understood how swiftly symbols multiply under stress. He could not afford another symbol tonight. What happened next was a negotiation conducted without ceremony. Naomi and Nicole did not push Hayley to leave. They drew a line around what remaining could mean. The waiting area would be staffed and humane and necessary. The rooms where data circulated would stay lean. Hayley could help with the supplies, manage arrivals, record the names of those willing to walk shoreline grids before sunrise. She would not cross the threshold into rooms where silence and concentration were oxygen. It was a respectful compromise and, in its way, a test. Hayley nodded, took a seat among people she did not know yesterday, passed cups and blankets, and began to write down contact numbers provided by people whose hands trembled after too little sleep. It was a usefulness that did not require applause. It also made her more acutely aware of the gulf between what she wanted and what the situation could sustain. Remaining on the periphery would look, from some angles, like discipline, from other angles like resignation. The video's image kept returning not as a grievance but as a reminder that public narratives calcify quickly around certain faces, and those faces would be asked to speak again in the morning if the search expanded. The lesson was harsh but clean. When a life is in danger, legitimacy comes from the work that moves the needle, not from the closeness of one's chair to the head of the table. Dawn arrived with an alert from a team along the river. An unregistered skiff discovered at a secondary dock near the old industrial corridor, just far enough from the obvious points to have been overlooked by casual traffic. The message snapped attention back into alignment. Bill assigned vehicles, split a contingent to remain at the house, and signaled the next sequence of calls. Dani stacked the folders she had prepared overnight, double-checked the contact list for rapid confirmation if the lead materialized, and moved toward the cars with the steadiness of someone who has learned that adrenaline wastes fuel. In the threshold, Hayley hesitated between two choices. She could follow the convoy, insisting on a seat earned not by readiness but by insistence, or she could stay where she had promised to stay and allow the plan to breathe. Either choice would write itself into the story everyone in the house would remember. A disciplined stay would mean relinquishing the immediate bomb of proximity in favor of a more anonymous contribution. A forcible ride-along would mean breaking the overnight truce and forcing others to absorb the cost. She felt the answer form not as a sentence but as a weight settling into place. She remained. The decision did not erase the previous night's gesture or the whispers it generated, but it carved a different groove for the hours ahead. A groove that might be remembered with less friction. Beneath the surface, the question of Caroline remained like cold mist on a windowpane. Perhaps she had been a true friend pushing against the inertia that often traps people in the most crucial moments. Perhaps she had nudged more than was kind because the spectacle of chaos seduces even the well-intentioned into testing another person's seams. Either way, the only thing that mattered inside this house was whether Hayley could allow the mission to trump the narrative she told herself about where she belonged. Last night's embrace could not be rewritten, and it would be translated by every witness through their own dictionary of pain and bias. What could be written now were the next actions, and actions are sometimes the only language that earns a hearing when emotions are loud. On the sun-washed steps, Bill glanced back across the hall, and for a fragment of a second his eyes met Hayley's. It was enough to ask and answer a question without words about how they would remember this day. Dani seated herself in the car with the documents on her lap and her shoulders set in a line that permitted no detours. Naomi and Nicole counted the people who would remain, confirmed the waiting area's supplies, and adjusted the schedule for incoming volunteers. The house, which had spent all night negotiating the tension between duty and identity, resumed its clean economy of motion. In the end, the soft detonation took place without spectacle. It happened in the interior recalibrations every person performed under pressure. By arriving against instruction, Hayley forced the house to articulate what had previously been a tacit assumption: that a crisis of this scale needs discipline more than ceremony, that the purpose is not to reseat relationships but to bring a child home. Naomi and Nicole drew that principle in firm lines, not to humiliate but to preserve function. Dani reaffirmed it with silence shaped into service. Bill shouldered the paradoxes without letting them drive the car. The public image of two parents speaking as one ceased to be a provocation and became a practical instrument, while the private ache of being displaced bent toward a new understanding. Closeness in calamity is measured less by where one stands and more by whether one's stance lightens the load on the point of greatest strain. If Caroline is the friend Hayley hopes she is, she will recognize the maturity in this and stop pressing on the thinnest glass. If not, the barbs will dull against the plain fact that some armors are forged not out of winning a scene but out of respecting the scheme that brings a missing person back alive. All of this settled into place before the river team transmitted their first photograph of the skiff and before the morning peeled open more concentric circles of search. And within the layered motion of those hours, a private chapter in Hayley's story was written without quotation marks or applause, only with the deliberate line of a choice. She had come because fear and pride and love collided. She stayed within bounds because the house could not welcome anything else. As she slid a sign-up sheet toward a volunteer with tired eyes and opened a fresh box of supplies, The answer to the question that had followed her from the kitchen arrived as a deed rather than a phrase. In tempests like this one, the deed that steadies the vessel is the only language everyone trusts, including the person most tempted to speak too loudly.